The stage arrived 40 minutes late into Black Ridge, which the driver said was on account of ice on the North Pass. But Evelyn suspected it was because the horses knew something the passengers didn't and had slowed themselves accordingly. She was the last one off. Not from hesitation. She wasn't built for hesitation anymore. That particular luxury had been scraped out of her somewhere between burying Thomas and selling the farm. But because it took time to get 9 children organized and moving in the same direction. The baby, Clara, was strapped to her chest inside a wool blanket that had seen better decades. The twins, Sam and Pete, were already climbing the wheel spokes before she could grab them by their collars and drag them back to earth. The older ones, Ethan at 16, Nora at 14, Ruth at 12, stood in a loose cluster near the luggage, watching the town with the particular wariness of children who had learned not to expect much from new places. Black Ridge, Montana Territory. Population, according to the advertisement, 412 souls. Evelyn counted maybe 30 of them standing on the main street right now, and not one of them looked glad to see her. She had expected a frontier town to feel rough. She had not expected it to feel like a held breath. The street was wide and dirt-packed and gray with old snow tramped into mud at the edges. There was a general store, a livery stable, a saloon with a broken shutter that banged against the frame every time the wind picked up, a church at the far end with a bell that hung crooked. The kind of town that had been trying to become something for a long time and hadn't quite managed it. The people watching her were not hostile exactly. They were something worse. They were pitying. A woman in a brown coat stood near the post office with her arms folded, shaking her head in a slow, private way. The kind of motion people make when they think they already know how a story ends. 2 men near the livery had stopped working entirely and were just watching. A boy Ethan's age pointed at the Harper children until an adult pulled his hand down. Evelyn squared her shoulders, shifted Clara higher on her chest, and walked toward the only person who seemed to be moving with purpose, a short, wide man with a gray beard coming toward her from the direction of the general store. "Mrs. Harper?" He pulled off his hat. "I'm Gus Howell. I run the store. Mr. Mercer sent word you were coming on today's stage." He paused, looked at the children stringing out behind her, and seemed to lose track of whatever he'd planned to say next. "That's correct," Evelyn said. "Is Mr. Mercer here?" "No, ma'am. He doesn't come into town much." Gus put his hat back on, then took it off again. He was clearly working up to something and having a hard time of it. "Mrs. Harper, I wonder if I might speak plainly." "Please." He looked at the children again. The older ones were listening. Ethan had his arms crossed in a posture that was a near-perfect imitation of her own. "Perhaps we might step inside," Gus said. "Whatever you need to say to me, you can say in front of my family." That seemed to knock him off balance. He cleared his throat, looked at the ground, then back up at her. "The man you've come to marry, Cole Mercer. His wife passed 14 months ago. Margaret was her name. She was well liked here." Another pause. "The manner of her passing it was ruled accidental, a fall in the house. But there are folks in this town, a good number of them, who don't believe that's what it was." The wind off the mountains had teeth in it. Clara stirred against Evelyn's chest and made a small, unhappy sound. Behind her, she could hear one of the younger children, probably Lily, who was 6 and had inherited Thomas's habit of asking questions at exactly the wrong moment, start to say something, and heard Nora quietly hush her. "Are you telling me," Evelyn said carefully, "that people here believe Cole Mercer killed his wife?" Gus Howell didn't answer that directly, which was an answer. "The Mercer Ranch is 3 miles north," he said. "I can arrange for your bags to be held here. If you'd like to think on things, have something to eat. The children look like they could use—" "Thank you, Mr. Howell." Evelyn looked down the street toward the north end where the mountains rose dark and jagged above the tree line. "Is there someone who can take us out to the ranch?" He stared at her. "We've been on a train for 4 days and a stagecoach for 2, she said. "My children are cold and hungry, and I need to meet the man whose advertisement I answered before I make any decisions. Can you arrange a wagon?" He arranged the wagon. Chab. She had found the advertisement in the Helena Gazette, tucked between a notice about missing cattle and an announcement for a land auction. She had been sitting at the kitchen table of her sister's house in Butte, which was a generous description for what was actually a 2-room shack with 7 people already living in it, and she'd been trying very hard not to think about the fact that she had 9 children and approximately $4.30 to her name. Rancher 38 seeks capable woman of good character for marriage and partnership in working cattle operation. Black Ridge, Montana Territory. Widow or woman of circumstance welcome. Property and home provided. Right to see Mercer. General delivery, Black Ridge. She had read it 3 times and then set it down and looked at her hands. Thomas had been gone 8 months. The fever had taken him in March, quick and without warning, the way fever does. Fine on a Monday, gone by Friday. The farm in Nebraska had been mortgaged twice over, once to survive the drought of 1886, and once because Thomas had believed, with the hopeful stubbornness of a man who wanted badly to provide for his family, that a third cattle purchase would turn things around. It hadn't. The bank had been patient, and then the bank had not been patient. By October, Evelyn had sold everything that could be sold, packed everything else into 3 bags, and moved her children west to her sister Agnes's house, because west was where people went when they had run out of other directions. Agnes was kind. Agnes's husband, Frank, was kind too, in the stiff way of a man who had already done the math on how many mouths he could feed. Agnes had 4 children of her own. The shack had 1 stove and thin walls and a smell of too many people that nothing dispelled. Evelyn had looked at her $4.30. She had looked at the advertisement. She had thought about her children sleeping 3 to a pallet on the floor of her sister's back room. She wrote to C. Mercer that same night. His response arrived 12 days later. It was not a long letter. Cole Mercer was not apparently a man who used words carelessly. He described the ranch, cattle operation, several hundred head, working land, a large house. He described what he was looking for: someone practical, capable, unafraid of hard work, able to manage a household, and here the phrasing had struck her as oddly precise, not easily frightened by difficulty. He said there was room for children, and he named no limit on that number. He asked one question: "Are you a woman who knows her own mind?" She had written back, "I am the only kind there is." He had sent train fare for all of them 2 weeks later. She had not told her sister everything about what she was doing. Agnes knew she was going to answer a marriage advertisement. Agnes thought it was reckless, and said so several times, in the direct way that sisters have, and Evelyn had listened and agreed that yes, it was reckless, and she was going to do it anyway because the alternative was watching her children slowly become a burden on people who were already carrying too much, and she could not live with that. What she had not told Agnes was that she was terrified, not of the unknown man exactly, of herself, of whether she had enough left in her to do this. Thomas had been gone 8 months, and she still reached for him in the mornings, that half-asleep moment before reality landed, and every time it landed it felt like losing him fresh. She was 34 years old, and she felt 100, and she had 9 children depending on her not to fall apart. She could not fall apart. She had gotten on the train. Sut. The wagon road north of Black Ridge ran through pine forests that thinned as the altitude rose, opening onto views of grassland gone brown and silver under a crust of old snow. The mountains were enormous and close, the kind of close that took getting used to. Evelyn had grown up on the plains where the sky was the tallest thing and the land went flat in every direction, and she still wasn't entirely comfortable with geography that loomed. The man driving the wagon, a young ranch hand named Dix, who worked for the livery and clearly had opinions about this errand that he was keeping mostly to himself, hadn't said more than 12 words since they left town. The children filled the silence adequately. The twins had gotten into a dispute about something that may have started as a philosophical disagreement and had degraded into a shoving contest. Lily was asking Nora to explain what accused meant. Ruth had gone quiet in the way she did when she was thinking hard about something and didn't want to be interrupted. Ethan rode beside Evelyn on the wagon bench. "That man in town," he said, "the store owner, Mr. Howell. He was trying to warn you off." "Yes." "Are you—" Ethan stopped. He was 16 and trying very hard this past year to carry himself like someone older, which sometimes worked and sometimes showed its seams. "Are you worried?" Evelyn considered the honest answer. "A little," she said, "but worry has never been a useful currency for me." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "What if he did do it? Then we'll know soon enough, and we'll figure out what to do from there." We could go back to Aunt Agnes. She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the road ahead with the set jaw of someone making themselves say a thing they didn't entirely believe. Agnes's house had been hard on Ethan. Not because Agnes or Frank had been unkind, but because at 16 a boy already understood when his family was excess, and that understanding had done something to him that she hadn't been able to undo. "We're not going back to Agnes," she said. Not unkindly. Not yet. "Let's meet the man first." The ranch appeared around a long curve of the road, and it was not what she'd pictured. She had expected something modest, a frontier homestead, well kept maybe, solid, the kind of place a practical man would build. What she saw instead was a house that must have been magnificent once and was still, even in its current state of incomplete repair, more substantial than anything she'd owned or lived in. 2 stories, wide porch across the front, stone foundation and timber frame, windows that had real glass in them, 4 across the upper floor, 6 across the lower. A barn of proportionate size behind it, corrals and outbuildings scattered at practical distances. The whole thing sat against a backdrop of mountain slope and dark pine, like something out of an illustration in a magazine, except that no magazine illustrator would have included the way 2 upper-floor shutters were hanging loose, or the porch rail that was missing its middle section, or the general look of a place that had been tended by someone going through the motions. "Big house," Sam said, reverently. "Too big," said Pete, who disagreed with Sam on principle. Dix pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the porch. He didn't get down. Evelyn handed Clara to Nora, climbed down without waiting to be helped, and looked at the front door. It opened before she reached the porch steps. Yeah, Cole Mercer was not what she'd pictured either. She wasn't sure what she'd pictured. Something of the advertisement, maybe. The precise language, the practical framing, the question about knowing her own mind. She had vaguely imagined someone competent and contained, a man who had organized himself into functionality after grief. He was tall, broader through the shoulders than the door frame gave him room to look comfortable in, dark-haired going to gray at the temples, with the kind of face that had been weathered into angles by outdoor work and probably some years of trouble. He was younger-looking than 38 and older-looking simultaneously. The way some people carry their grief in their posture rather than their features, so that their face looks younger than their body does. He was wearing work clothes that were clean but not recently pressed, and he had the particular stillness of a man who had learned to be careful about how he moved in public. He stopped on the porch, looked at Evelyn, looked past her at the wagon full of children, all of whom had gone quiet in that uncanny way children sometimes did when they were collectively assessing whether a situation was safe. "Mrs. Harper," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected. Careful. "Mr. Mercer." She stopped at the base of the porch steps and looked up at him. "I think you should tell me what Mr. Howell was trying to tell me in town, and I'd prefer you tell it straight." Something moved across his face. Not guilt, exactly. She had seen guilt. Thomas's brother had been a man who carried guilt everywhere with him, and it had a particular soft, avoidant quality. This was something harder, closer to exhaustion. "You already heard something," he said. "Enough to ask the question." He came down the porch steps slowly, stopped a few feet from her, and looked at her with the direct attention of someone who had decided that honesty was the only option he had left. "My wife Margaret died 14 months ago. A fall down the main staircase in the evening. I was the only other person in the house. The doctor ruled it accidental." He paused. "A good portion of Black Ridge does not believe that. The sheriff investigated and found nothing, but—" He stopped again, and she could see him choose the next words carefully. "There is a man in this territory, Judge Aldrich Holt. He controls most of what happens in this county. He and my father had arrangements. After my father died and I took over the ranch, I ended those arrangements. Holt has had reason since then to want my credibility destroyed." His jaw tightened. "I'm telling you this because you deserve to know it before you decide anything. I did not hurt Margaret, but I cannot prove that to the satisfaction of people who have been told otherwise." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. Behind her, she could hear Clara fussing again, and the low sound of Nora's voice settling her. She could hear the twins, silence from them now, which was either a good sign or a very bad one. The wind came down off the mountain slopes with the smell of pine and cold stone, She thought about the $4 in her coat pocket. She thought about Agnes's back room. She thought about Ethan's face when he'd said we could go back. The way he'd meant it as an offer, not a preference. "Have you had the house properly heated?" she said. Cole Mercer blinked. "Pardon?" "It's 15 degrees and I have a 7-month-old baby. Is the house warm?" He looked at her for another second, and something in his expression shifted in a way she couldn't entirely read. "Yes," he said. "I lit the fires this morning." "Good." She turned back to the wagon. "Ethan, help your sisters down. Sam, Pete, if either of you puts a hand on any fence or gate out here until Mr. Mercer tells you what's what, I will personally—" She lowered her voice on the specifics, but the twins got the message. "Nora, bring Clara. Ruth, can you manage the smaller bag?" She turned back to Cole Mercer, who was standing very still on his own porch steps, watching this organized unloading with an expression she would later decide was somewhere between bewildered and something he hadn't felt in a long time. "I'm not making any permanent decisions today," she said, "but I'm also not making them on an empty stomach in a wagon yard. You said there was room. We'll come inside and we'll talk." He stepped aside to let them in. "Just." The house was warm. She registered that first, with the gratitude of someone who hadn't been fully warm since October. The main room had a stone fireplace large enough to walk into, and someone, Cole presumably, had built a fire that was doing its job properly. The furniture was heavy and dark, and looked like it had come from somewhere with more money than the territory usually saw. The floors were wide plank, well fitted. There was a kitchen at the back with a wood stove that had been recently blacked. The children spread through the house with the cautious curiosity of animals checking new territory. The younger ones drifted toward the fireplace. Ruth stood in the middle of the main room and turned slowly, looking at everything. Ethan stayed close to Evelyn. Cole Mercer stood near the kitchen doorway, watching all of this, clearly uncertain what to do with himself. "Do you have flour?" Evelyn said. Yes." "And salt pork?" "There's a full smokehouse." "Good." She was already removing her coat. "My children haven't had a proper meal since Missoula. I'm going to cook. You're going to sit at that table and you're going to tell me everything about this ranch, the land, the cattle, the finances, the arrangements with this judge, and whatever else you think I should know. And then I'll tell you what I think." She paused. "Is there anything in this kitchen I should know about before I start?" Cole Mercer pulled out a chair and sat down. He had the look of a man who had been braced for a large number of possible conversations and had not prepared for this one. "The middle burner runs hot," he said. "Noted." She cooked. He talked. The ranch was called the Mercer Reach, a name his father had given it, one Cole had kept because changing it felt like more of a statement than he wanted to make. The land ran nearly 4,000 acres from the mountain foothills down through 2 creek drainages to the flat grassland, prime grazing country. There were 430 head of cattle, 8 horses, a working crew of 3 men who lived in the bunkhouse, and who Cole had warned this morning that the new woman was arriving and they should behave themselves. His father, Nathaniel Mercer, had built all of this starting in 1861, had arrived in Montana Territory with capital from somewhere Cole had never fully traced, had acquired land in the years when acquiring land meant different things than it did on paper, and had built an operation that was, by any external measure, a success. Nathaniel had died 3 years ago, leaving Cole to inherit both the ranch and a set of obligations he hadn't known existed. "What kind of obligations?" Evelyn said. She was making biscuits. Clara was asleep in a blanket nest near the warm stove. The other children had distributed themselves, some helping her, some in the main room, Ethan still at the kitchen table, listening. Cole glanced at Ethan. Evelyn shook her head slightly. "He stays." "Financial arrangements," Cole said. "My father paid Aldrich Holt, the county judge, a portion of the ranch's income, every year regular as taxes. In return, certain questions about how the land was originally acquired never got asked." Evelyn's hand slowed on the biscuit dough. "Questions like what?" Ethan said. "Like whether the families who settled on some of this land before my father arrived were pushed off it legally, or legally enough." Cole's voice stayed even. It had the quality of someone reporting facts about something they'd had a long time to develop opinions about. I found the records after Nathaniel died. It took me a while to understand what I was looking at. When I finally did, I stopped paying Holt. What happened then? Evelyn said. Margaret died. He said it flatly, without inflection, and then the flatness cracked slightly at the edges. 6 months after I told Holt the arrangement was over, she fell down the stairs. I found her. The investigation was brief. The kitchen was quiet except for the stove and the far sound of the younger children in the main room. You think Holt had her killed, Ethan said. I think it's possible someone in his pay did something that was made to look like an accident, Cole said. I can't prove it. I have the financial records, the payments my father made going back 20 years. I have documents about the original land acquisitions that don't look right. But proving what happened to Margaret, he stopped. I don't know how to do that. Evelyn set the biscuits in the pan and put them in the oven. She wiped her hands on a cloth and turned around and looked at him. He was sitting with his elbows on the table and his hands loosely linked in front of him, and he was watching her with the expression of a man who had gotten very practiced at people deciding to leave. These records, she said. Where are they? There's a room off the study, locked. Margaret had started going through them in the months before. He stopped again. Started again. She was careful. She kept her own notes. Can I see them? Cole Mercer was quiet for a moment. I'll show you tomorrow, if you're still here. I'll be here, Evelyn said. He looked at her with something she couldn't name. You said you weren't making permanent decisions today. I said that, she agreed, but I'm not leaving tonight either. My children need to sleep in beds, and so do I. The first biscuits smelled like something real and warm, and the younger children materialized at the kitchen doorway by a kind of instinct, the way they always had, crowding the entrance with their winter-flushed faces and their hunger. And Evelyn looked at them and then looked at Cole Mercer and said, Set the table. I don't know where anything is. He got up and opened the right drawer on the first try. After supper, biscuits and salt pork and a pot of bean soup from dried beans she'd found in the pantry. After the younger children were settled in various rooms upstairs, where Cole had shown them without comment, after Clara was fed and asleep again, after Ethan had finally gone up despite his best efforts to stay awake and relevant, Evelyn sat alone at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and looked at the fire in the stove through the iron grate. She was exhausted in a way that had become her baseline. She was 34 years old, and she had been exhausted since Thomas died. And before that, if she was honest with herself, since Lily was born, and she'd stopped sleeping properly. She had been tired for so long she barely remembered what the alternative felt like. But the children had eaten, really eaten, not made due portions, not the shameful small servings that Agnes's household had managed to afford for 2 months. Clara had nursed properly for the first time in days. Sam and Pete had gone upstairs without complaint, which meant they were actually tired rather than performing tiredness to avoid chores, and that was practically a miracle. The house was warm. It was solid around her. She thought about the records Cole had described, the payments, the land acquisitions, Margaret's notes. She thought about a woman she'd never known, going through old papers in a locked room, trying to understand something that eventually got her killed. Or had gotten her killed. Possibly. Are you a woman who knows her own mind? She picked up the cold coffee and drank it anyway. Yes, she thought. I am. She blew out the kitchen lamp and went upstairs to the room Cole had given her. The one with a proper bed and a window that looked north toward the mountains, which in the dark were just a solid blackness that blocked out the lower stars. And she lay down in her clothes because it was cold, and she didn't have the energy to undress, and she looked at the ceiling of a house that wasn't hers yet and might never be, in a town that had watched her arrive with pity, in a territory that had already killed one woman for asking too many questions. She was still thinking when she fell asleep. Outside, the wind came off the mountains and the frost settled harder, and Black Ridge held its breath, and somewhere 3 miles south of the Mercer Reach, in a large heated office above the county courthouse, a man named Aldrich Holt received word that Cole Mercer's mail-order woman had arrived with a wagon full of children, and unlike the others who had answered his advertisement, had actually stayed. Holt had received this news before, twice. Both times the woman had been gone by morning. He assumed this one would be no different. He was wrong about that. He would be wrong about Evelyn Harper in many ways, and every time he was wrong about her, it would cost him something he couldn't get back. But that was still ahead. For now, the ranch was quiet. 9 children were sleeping under a roof that didn't leak. A man who hadn't cooked a proper meal in 14 months was sitting alone in his study with a glass of whiskey he wasn't drinking, staring at a locked door. And a woman who had buried her husband, lost her farm, moved her children west with $4 in her coat pocket, and stepped off a stagecoach into a town full of people shaking their heads at her. That woman was already making plans. She was always making plans. It was the only thing she knew how to do instead of giving up. The locked room off the study smelled like old paper and something underneath that. Dust, maybe, or the particular staleness of a space that had been sealed for longer than it should have been. Cole turned the key in the lock with the careful movement of someone opening something they weren't sure they should, and the door swung inward on hinges that needed oil. Evelyn stepped inside. It wasn't large. A desk against the far wall, a single window with the curtain drawn, 2 wooden filing cabinets that ran floor to ceiling and stacked on nearly every flat surface, ledgers, dozens of them. Some bound in leather that had cracked and dried, some just heavy paper covers tied with cord, all of them with dates written on the spines in handwriting that varied between neat and hurried depending, she suspected, on the year and the mood of the man who'd written them. "These go back how far?" she said. 1861, Cole said from the doorway. He didn't come in. She noticed that. That was the first year my father filed a land claim out here. Evelyn moved to the filing cabinet on the left and pulled it open. Folders, letters, maps hand-drawn on paper that had yellowed to the color of old cream. She picked up one of the maps and held it toward the gray morning light from the window. It showed a land boundary, survey markings, creek lines, measurements. In the corner, a date. March 1863. "What was here in 1863, she said. Cole was quiet for a moment. "A family named Sorrel. Homesteaders. They'd been on that creek drainage for 2 years. And in 1864? It was Mercer land." She set the map down carefully and looked at the next one. She spent 3 hours in that room while the older children managed the younger ones downstairs with the negotiated authority of siblings who had learned to run a household out of necessity. Cole appeared twice, once to bring her coffee without being asked, which she acknowledged with a nod, and once to answer a question about a name that appeared in one of the ledgers, a man called Prentice, who seemed to function as some kind of intermediary. "Land agent," Cole said. "My father hired him to handle the paperwork on acquisitions. He died in 1879. "Conveniently," Evelyn said. Cole's mouth tightened. "I'd thought the same thing." What she found in those 3 hours was not a single smoking document, not a confession, not anything that clean. What she found was a pattern, the kind of pattern that only became visible when you laid enough pieces side by side and stood back far enough to see the shape of it. Payments to Holt going back 22 years, recorded in a column in Nathaniel Mercer's ledger under the heading County Administration in handwriting that was careful and even, the handwriting of a man who was not ashamed of what he was writing down because he never expected anyone else to read it. Corresponding land transfers, sometimes within weeks of those payments, sometimes months later, that moved property from homesteading families to the Mercer Reach. Survey documents that had been slightly altered. She could see the erasure marks if she angled the paper right, the original lines still faintly visible beneath the corrections. And then, near the back of the second filing cabinet, in a folder that had been tucked behind what appeared to be old horse breeding records, Margaret's notes. Evelyn went still when she found them. The handwriting was different from Nathaniel's. Smaller, faster, the writing of someone thinking out loud on paper. Margaret had organized what she'd found into a list, each entry cross-referenced to a ledger and a date. At the top of the first page, underlined twice, Sorrel, Beaumont, Chen, Rafe family, original claims. Below that, in smaller writing, find where they went, find what was owed. At the bottom of the last page, a note that had clearly been added later, the ink slightly different. Holt knows I have this. Be careful. Evelyn sat with that page for a long time. She thought about a woman she had never met, sitting in the same room, reading the same documents, coming to the same conclusions. She thought about the staircase at the front of the house, the wide, solid staircase with the good banister that she'd noted her first evening here, with the automatic assessment of a mother of young children, checking for hazards. She thought about what be careful meant when you wrote it to yourself and didn't tell anyone else. She brought the notes out to Cole. He was in the main room, doing something with a piece of harness leather that probably wasn't occupying as much of his attention as he was pretending. He looked up when she came in and looked at what she was holding, and something happened to his face that she looked away from because it felt private. "She found the same things I found," Evelyn said. "I know." His voice came out rougher than he'd intended. He cleared it. "I found those a few weeks after. I don't know if she'd told anyone what she'd found. I don't know if she'd talked to Holt directly or if someone in his pay found out another way." Evelyn sat down across from him. Claire was in a basket near the fire, asleep. The twins were outside somewhere, audible through the walls in a distant, manageable way. Ruth had appeared in the doorway of the kitchen and then disappeared again with the particular tact of a 12-year-old who understood more than adults generally credited. "She wrote that Holt knew," Evelyn said. "Yes." "Then he knows you have these records." "Yes." "And he knows you're not paying him anymore." "Yes." Evelyn set the notes on the table between them. "Then why are you still alive?" Cole looked at her with an expression that said this was a question he'd asked himself. "I think he's been waiting to see if I'd fold. Come back to the arrangement on my own, after—" He didn't finish that sentence. "Or find some other reason to shut me down that looks less like what it is. He's got the county sheriff in his pocket. He's got the circuit court. He's got most of the business in Black Ridge depending on his goodwill one way or another. Gus Howell at the general store? Holt holds the note on his building. Same with the livery, same with the saloon. Half the town is financed through a land company that Holt controls." Cole set down the harness leather. "He doesn't need to do anything fast or dirty when he can just wait and apply pressure." "But he did do something fast and dirty," Evelyn said. "If Margaret found out what she found and then fell down the stairs." The fire cracked. Cole didn't answer that, and she hadn't expected him to. "Those families," she said. "Sorrel, Beaumont, Chen, Rafe. Do you know what happened to them?" "Some of them." He rubbed the back of his neck. "The Beaumonts left the territory entirely. The Chen family, but there's a man named Wei Chen who works at the assay office in Gallatin. I believe he's the grandson of the original settler." He stopped. "I sent him a letter last year." He didn't respond. "Did you tell him why you were writing?" "I told him I was trying to correct some historical records about land claims." "That's not the same as telling him why," Evelyn said. Cole looked at her for a moment. "No," he said. "I suppose it isn't." She picked up Margaret's notes again and looked at the list of names. Find where they went. Find what was owed. Margaret had written those words like they were instructions to herself for later, things to do, a list that had a morning and an afternoon attached to it. The assumption of time that nobody had warned her she didn't have. "We need to find them," Evelyn said, "or their families. And we need to figure out where Holt is keeping his own records, because the Mercer ledgers document what your father paid, but they don't document what Holt did with it or who else he brought into it." Cole was watching her in the way he'd started watching her, with a careful attention that wasn't quite suspicion and wasn't quite trust, something in between, like a man checking a bridge before he commits his full weight to it. "You've been here less than 48 hours, he said. "I'm aware. You could leave. Take the children. I'll give you money for the stage back to Butte. You don't have to—" "Cole." She said his given name for the first time, and he went quiet. "I read those documents. I read your dead wife's notes. I know what this is." She met his eyes steadily. "I'm not going to pretend I don't know it so I can leave with a clear conscience." He was silent for a long moment. Outside, one of the twins had apparently located something interesting enough to call the other one over, and their voices rose and then settled. "What do you need?" Cole said finally. "I need to understand the full shape of it, all of it. Not just the land fraud, the rest of it, the murders, if there are more than Margaret. Whatever it is Holt has done that he's paid people 22 years to cover." She paused. "And I need to know your ranch hands, personally. I need to know which of them are yours and which of them might be reporting back to someone else." Cole didn't look surprised by that last part, which told her something. "There are 3. Dix, you met him. The livery man is his uncle. Good kid, loyal to the ranch. Tom Birch, he's been here 12 years, since before my father died. and a man named Garrett Flood, who my father hired about 6 years ago, and who I've never been completely sure about. Tell me about Flood. He's competent, does his work, doesn't talk much. Cole picked up the harness leather again and set it down. Last spring, I found him coming out of the study when he had no reason to be in the house at all. He said he was looking for me to ask about the spring fence repair. It was a reasonable enough answer. But the study door was cracked when I found him, and I'd left it closed. Evelyn nodded slowly. I want to meet all three of them today. I can arrange that. Casually, she said. Not like you're bringing them in for inspection. Cole almost smiled at that. It was a brief thing, there and gone, the involuntary kind that came from something landing right. Tom's got a sense of humor about him. He'll take to you. Dix is 22 and easily flustered. Flood? He thought about it. Flood will be polite and tell you nothing. That's fine, Evelyn said. I just need to see how he carries himself when he's being watched. She stood up and gathered the notes. These shouldn't stay in the locked room. If someone knows they exist, that's the first place they'd look. Where do you suggest? She looked around the main room. Her eyes stopped on the fireplace, specifically on the narrow gap between the right-hand side of the mantel and the stone wall behind it, a space that existed because of slightly uneven construction, the kind of thing you only noticed if you were in the habit of looking for where things could be hidden. She crossed to it and checked with her fingers. 6 inches deep, maybe. More than enough. Here, she said. Cole watched her tuck the folder into the gap. You've hidden things before, he said. It wasn't a question. Envelope of cash when Thomas started having trouble with the bank, she said. Sewed it into the mattress first, then moved it when the bankman started coming around the house. Ended up inside the chimney flue of the second bedroom. She pressed the folder flat against the stone. The men who come for things always check the obvious places first. He was quiet for a moment. Margaret would have liked you, he said. She didn't answer that right away. She was thinking about a woman she'd never met who had underlined names and written "be careful" and then run out of time. She was thinking about how Margaret had been in this house, in this room, looking at this fireplace. I hope I would have liked her too, she said. Tantas mashmasim. She met the ranch hands that afternoon. Tom Birch was exactly what Cole had described. A weathered man in his 50s with creased eyes and a manner of speaking that suggested he'd spent a long time working alone and had learned to enjoy his own company. He shook Evelyn's hand with the firm grip of someone who didn't calibrate it for her being a woman, which she appreciated, and then immediately crouched down to address Pete and Sam at their own level and asked them with complete seriousness whether they had any experience with horses, because he had a gelding in the South Paddock with an attitude problem that had defeated every approach he'd tried. Pete had said yes before Sam could, and Sam had said yes louder, and Tom Birch had looked up at Evelyn with the small smile of a man who had just solved 2 problems at once. They'll be underfoot, she warned him. Ranch needs a little underfoot, he said, and that was that. Dix was as advertised. Young, earnest, with the specific awkwardness of a man who had been told to behave himself around a woman and was concentrating so hard on it that he'd forgotten how to use his arms naturally. He knocked over a water bucket within 2 minutes of being introduced, righted it with a speed and noise that startled Clara awake, then turned the color of a brick and apologized to the baby directly. Evelyn told him Clara had heard worse, and she liked him immediately. Garrett Flood she met last. He was in the barn, mending a piece of fence wire, and he straightened when Cole and Evelyn came in and looked at her with dark eyes that gave her nothing useful. He was maybe 40. Lean in the way of men who work hard and eat without thinking about it. A face that had good bones but had arranged them into an expression that didn't invite conversation. Mrs. Harper, he said. His voice was flat and even. Mr. Flood. She looked at the fence wire. Cole said you're the one who usually handles the south fence line in spring. That's right. How much wire do you think you'll need? A brief pause. She'd been specific enough that it required an actual answer, not just acknowledgement. Depends on the winter damage, he said. I'll have to ride it before I can say. Of course, she nodded. I'll let you get back to it. Walking back to the house, Cole said nothing until they were out of earshot. Well, he said. He's watchful, Evelyn said. He looked at me, but he was watching you look at me. Cole considered that. Meaning? Meaning he wanted to see if you'd given me some kind of signal, whether I was someone to be careful around. She pulled her coat closer against the cold. He doesn't know yet what to do with me. That's useful. You got all that from 2 minutes and a question about fence wire. I got all that from his hands, she said. He stopped working the second we walked in. A man who's comfortable keeps working while he talks. He stopped completely. That's someone who decides what to do before he does anything. Cole walked in silence for a moment. You think he reports to Holt? I think it's possible. I think we should assume it is and act accordingly. She stopped at the porch steps. Don't confront him. Don't change how you treat him. The moment he knows we're suspicious, we lose whatever advantage we have in him not knowing that. Cole nodded slowly. There was that look again, so the bridge testing look, the weight checking. But she thought it had shifted slightly, a little more trust in it, or at least a little less caution. What? 3 days later, Ethan came to her at breakfast with a look on his face that she had learned to read accurately, the look of a 16-year-old boy who had discovered something he wasn't entirely sure how to present to his mother without her telling him he shouldn't have been where he'd been when he found it. I was in the south barn, he said. The old one, the one Cole said isn't used anymore. I told you to stay out of the outbuildings we haven't been shown. I know. He sat down across from her. He had Thomas's jaw when he said it like that, the same stubbornness, the same under-it-all sincerity. There's a horse in there. Evelyn looked up from her coffee. A good one, fed, watered, tacked up. He met her eyes. Tacked up, Ma. Like someone's planning to leave in a hurry. She was up and putting on her coat before he finished speaking. Show me. She didn't tell Cole. Not yet. She went with Ethan through the back way, around the far side of the bunkhouse, to the south barn that Cole had described as a derelict structure from the early days of the ranch and hadn't been in service for a decade. The padlock on the main door had been recently replaced. The metal was bright and new against the weathered wood. There was a secondary door at the side, a small one, and it opened when Ethan tried it. Inside was dim and smelled of fresh hay and horse. A black mare, well kept, saddled. Saddlebags that were full, she checked quickly. Money, mostly. Some papers she didn't have time to read in dim light. Food enough for a few days' ride. She looked at the papers quickly, tilting them toward the crack of light from the side door. They were letters. 2 of them, sealed, addressed in handwriting she didn't recognize. One to someone called Halford in Gallatin, and one with no name. Just a symbol at the top that might have been an initial or might have been something else. She put them back exactly as she'd found them. Don't say anything to anyone, she told Ethan. Not the other children, not the hands. Not Cole? She thought about that for a moment. Not yet. She needed to think first. The horse being here meant Flood, if it was Flood, was ready to leave. Which meant something was coming. Which meant whatever Holt was going to do, it was closer than she'd thought. Ma, Ethan said, and his voice had gone quieter. What are we into? She looked at him, her firstborn, who had grown up faster than was fair, who had held things together in the months after Thomas died in ways she'd only partially understood until later. His eyes were Thomas's, too, that same light brown that read as gold in the right light. Something that needed someone to be in it, she said, or it would have gone on forever. He looked at her for a long moment and then nodded. The solid, considered nod of someone choosing to commit to a direction without guarantees. Okay, he said. What do we do? She told Cole that evening after the children were in bed. She told him all of it, the horse, the saddlebags, the letters, and she watched his face go through several things in quick succession before settling into something that was controlled anger, the kind that went cold rather than hot. He's been in my house, Cole said. His voice was quiet. For 6 years. He may have been the one who found out what Margaret was doing, Evelyn said. Or he may not have known what the consequences would be. There's a difference. Not much of one. Cole. She waited until he looked at her. If you confront him tonight, you lose whatever he knows and you lose the chance to know what's coming. Holt doesn't know that we know. That's the only edge we have right now. His jaw was tight. You're asking me to let him stay. I'm asking you to let him stay for a few more days while we figure out what he's being sent to report. She folded her hands on the table. Whatever Holt is planning, the timing matters. Flood is ready to leave, which means something's about to happen that Holt wants him away from before it does. Cole pushed back from the table and stood up, moved to the window that looked out toward the dark outline of the bunkhouse. Stood there with his back to her. I keep thinking, he said without turning around, that if I'd moved faster, after I found my father's records, if I hadn't waited. You waited because you didn't know what to do with it, Evelyn said. That's not the same thing as not caring. It amounts to the same result. She didn't argue that, because there was some truth in it, and he didn't need her to be agreeable. He needed her to be honest. Yes, she said. But we're not going backward. We can't. She stood up. I'm going to write a letter tonight to a man named Wei Chen in Gallatin. Cole turned around. Margaret's list. Holt's records will be in Gallatin, or close to it. That's where the county courthouse is. That's where the circuit court is. That's where the federal land office operates. If Wei Chen's family was displaced from this land, and if there's anyone left who remembers it, they're the kind of testimony that federal officials will have to take seriously. She pulled her coat off the hook by the kitchen door. Your father's ledgers prove money changed hands. Margaret's notes prove what it bought. What I need is someone who can testify to what was taken. He won't respond. I told you. You told him you were correcting historical records, Evelyn said. I'm going to tell him the truth. Cole looked at her. The fire in the main room threw a low amber light through the doorway between them. He was tired. Not tonight's tired, but the accumulated tired of 14 months of being alone in this house with this knowledge and no clear path through it. She could see that in him plainly. How do you do that? He said. Do what? Stay. He stopped, searched for the word. Sure, stay that sure of the next step. She thought about it honestly. I don't, she said. I'm mostly terrified, but I found that if I keep moving, the terror has trouble keeping up. He almost laughed at that. Not quite, but closer to it than the first time, and the shape of it stayed in his face a little longer. I'll get you paper, he said. She wrote the letter by lamplight while the house settled around her and the fire burned down to coals. Outside, the Montana night was sharp and clear and cold, the stars enormous in a way that still surprised her after weeks. Somewhere in the south barn, a well-kept black mare waited in the dark. And 3 miles south, in a large heated office, Aldrich Holt sat with a glass of something expensive and a map of the Mercer Reach spread on his desk and thought about how much patience he had left, and decided that the window for patience had just about closed. He sent a rider to the county sheriff that same night. Everything that was coming had already been set in motion. Evelyn just didn't know yet how fast it was moving. The letter to Wei Chen came back unopened. Evelyn found it on the hall table on a Tuesday morning, returned with a postal mark from Gallatin and no explanation. Just the envelope she'd sent, intact, sitting there like a quiet refusal. She stood and looked at it for a moment, then put it in her coat pocket and went to start breakfast. She didn't mention it to Cole. He had enough to carry. What she did instead was write a second letter, this one to a woman named Ida Beaumont, whose name she'd found in a secondary folder in the locked room, not on Margaret's list, but in an older correspondence, a brief exchange from 1878 between Nathaniel Mercer and a land agent that referenced the Beaumont family's forwarding address in a town called Harlow, 2 counties east. It was thin, it was 20 years old, but it was something, and something was what she had. She was sealing the envelope when Cole came in from the early cold with mud on his boots, and his jaw set in a way she'd started recognizing. The set that meant something had happened outside that he was still deciding how to tell her. She waited. Flood's gone, he said. She looked up. When? Tom found the bunkhouse bunk empty this morning. His gear's gone. The south barn. He stopped. The mare, too, she said. You knew she might go. I knew it was coming. I didn't know when. She set down the envelope. Did Tom see anything? He heard a horse in the night, thought it was one of the paddock animals, didn't think enough of it to get up. Cole pulled off his coat and hung it with the focused deliberateness of a man trying to keep himself from hitting something. He's been in my house for 6 years, Evelyn. I know. Eating at my table 6 years. Cole. She waited until he turned. He's gone, which means Holt knows we haven't moved. He sent Flood out, which means he's decided to stop waiting. She picked up the letter. We need to move faster than they do. He looked at the letter in her hand. Beaumont? There may be a daughter, maybe a granddaughter. The forwarding address is old, but the town is small. Someone will remember the family. He nodded. Slowly, the set in his jaw shifted. Not released, but redirected, the way a river doesn't lose its force just because it finds a new channel. I'll write it out to the post office myself. Dix can... A sound from outside stopped him. Not loud, just wrong. The specific sound of more than one horse on the road, moving at the pace of people who aren't in a hurry because they don't have to be. Evelyn was at the window first. 4 riders coming up the road from Black Ridge. In front, a man she recognized by description even though she'd never met him. The sheriff, Bart Cousins, who Cole had mentioned in the way people mention something they've been managing and are tired of. He was heavy-set and rode with the particular ease of someone accustomed to arriving somewhere and being the most important thing in it. Behind him, 3 deputies she didn't know, carrying rifles in the casual way of men who carry rifles so often they've stopped being conscious of them. How many children are in the house right now? She said, without turning from the window. Cole came to stand beside her. Ruth took the younger ones down to the creek to look for, I don't know, rocks. Something Tom told Pete about rocks. His voice had gone flat. Ethan's in the north barn. So right now it's you, me, Nora, and Clara. Yes. She did the math quickly. Not the math of fear, but the math of options, which she'd found over the years were 2 very different calculations that used some of the same numbers. Go to the door. I'll stay back. Let them do the talking first. He went. She moved to the side of the main window where she could see the porch without being clearly visible from outside, and she shifted Clara in her arms to a hold that would be secure if she needed to move fast. Clara looked up at her with the serene attention of a 7-month-old who hadn't yet developed the capacity for anxiety and made a small noise of contentment that felt, in that particular moment, almost absurd. She heard the door open. Cole's voice, level. Sheriff Cousins. Cole. A pause. The sound of horses being stilled, saddle leather. I'm going to need you to come with me into town. On what grounds? Warrant signed by Judge Holt. Murder of Margaret Ann Mercer. A silence that lasted long enough to have weight. The investigation on Margaret's death was closed 14 months ago, Cole said. Ruled accidental. Judge Holt has reconsidered the evidence. Cousins' voice had the rehearsed quality of someone delivering a prepared statement. There's a witness come forward. What witness? That'll be for the court to... What witness, Bart? Cole's voice dropped, which somehow made it carry more than if he'd raised it. Another pause. A man named Flood. Garrett Flood. He says he witnessed an altercation between you and your wife on the evening of her death. Evelyn's grip on Clara tightened slightly. Flood. Of course. That was what the saddlebags had been for, what the ready horse had been for. Not fleeing trouble, but delivering testimony that he'd been holding in reserve, ready to spend when Holt decided it was time. He's lying, Cole said. That'll also be for the court. He's lying and you know it, Bart. The silence this time was different, something in it that wasn't quite the sheriff's official composure, some small friction in it, a man doing a thing he wasn't entirely at peace with. I'm doing my job, Cole. I need you to come peaceable. Evelyn stepped into the doorway. She hadn't thought it through completely. She was operating on instinct, and her instinct said that a woman with a baby in her arms was harder to ride roughshod over than a man standing alone, because there were at least 2 of these deputies who had children of their own and would feel that in a way they couldn't make themselves not feel it. Mr. Cousins, she said. The sheriff looked at her. She saw him recalibrate. The baby, the unfamiliar woman, the specific arithmetic of the situation shifting on him. Ma'am, he said. His hat came off by reflex, then went back on because he remembered he was here on official business. I'm Evelyn Harper, she said. I'm going to be Mrs. Mercer. I'd like to understand this warrant before my husband goes anywhere. She had never referred to Cole as her husband before. She felt him go still beside her. Is it a federal warrant or county? Cousins blinked. County. Signed by Judge Holt specifically? He's the circuit court judge, ma'am. That's his authority. In the county, Evelyn said, not federal jurisdiction. She kept her voice level and inquiring, the tone of someone simply trying to get the facts organized. And the witness, this Mr. Flood, he's given sworn testimony? He's given a statement. There's a difference. Cousins looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who had come to do something simple and found it complicated. Ma'am, I've got a warrant and I'm going to execute it. Of course, she said, I'm not stopping you. She looked at Cole, and she made sure her eyes said everything her mouth couldn't say in front of 4 armed men. Go. It's all right. I have a plan even if I only have part of one. Cole, you should go with Sheriff Cousins. Cooperate fully. She looked back at the sheriff. He'll need to be able to communicate with legal counsel. That's his right. He can write letters from the county jail same as anyone, Cousins said. Who's the nearest federal land office contact? She said. The question wasn't aimed at Cousins exactly. She was half thinking out loud, which she did sometimes when she was working through something, and it always unsettled people who weren't used to it. Ma'am, I'm just asking, for my own information. She shifted Clara. Has a date been set for arraignment? Cousins stared at her. One of the deputies had developed an expression that might have been amusement if it weren't accompanied by a rifle. Lady, Cousins said, I don't know where you came from or what you think you know about county law, but I'm not here to answer questions. I'm here to take Cole Mercer into custody. Then take him, she said. He'll go peacefully. She looked at Cole again. His jaw was tight enough to crack, and his eyes were doing several things she understood. The anger, the fear he was managing, the trust he was extending to her that she could feel the weight of like something physical. Don't do anything reckless, he said. It was ambiguous enough that it could have meant anything. She knew he meant it at her. I never do, she said, which was not entirely true, and they both knew it. He went down the porch steps. Cousins' deputies moved into position without drama. Professional, which somehow made it worse than if they'd been rough about it. Cole mounted a deputy's spare horse and they rode back down the road toward Black Ridge without looking back. Evelyn stood on the porch until they were out of sight. Clara made another noise, something conversational and untroubled, and Evelyn looked down at her and said, very quietly, I know. Then she went inside to find Ethan. He was in the north barn when she got there, exactly where Cole had said, working on something with a piece of tack that he set down immediately when he saw her face. She told him quickly and without softening it. Cole had been arrested. False witness. Holtz County warrant. She watched Ethan process this, the quick flash of fear that he was young enough not to hide completely, and then the compression of it, the same thing she did herself, pushing it down to where it couldn't interfere with thinking. What do we need to do? He said. She had been thinking since the moment she'd stepped off the porch. The evidence in the house, the ledgers, your father's records, Margaret's notes behind the mantel, all of it needs to go somewhere safe before Holt sends men to search. He'll do it with legal authority, a warrant to search the property, probably following the arrest. She paused. We can't outrun that, but we can make sure what they're looking for isn't here when they come. Ethan straightened. He was 16 and lean and had a kind of forward-leaning energy when he was focused, like something wound tight. Where do I take it? Gallatin, she said. The Federal Land Office. There's a territorial marshal's office there, too. I saw it mentioned in some of the correspondence I read. Federal authority outranks Holtz County Court. If you walk in with those documents and ask to speak to a federal marshal, they have to hear you. That's a 3-day ride. Through the North Pass, it might be 2.5 if the weather holds. He looked at her steadily. You want me to go alone? Tom will go with you, she said. I trust him. What about you? What about the others? This was the part she'd been thinking hardest about. 9 children, with Ethan and Tom gone. 3 miles from a town that was in Holt's pocket. A man in the county jail on false charges. An unknown timeline for whatever Holt's next move was. I'll have Dix, she said. And Ruth is 12 and capable in ways you don't always give her credit for. Nora's 14 and she's been holding this family together since Nebraska. She put her hand briefly on his arm. I need you to do this, Ethan. You're the only one I trust with what's in those documents and with what to say when you get there. He was quiet for a moment. The barn smelled of hay and horse and the sharp, clean cold that came in through the cracks in the boards, and outside the Montana sky was the flat white of incoming weather, which was either the worst timing or no worse than any other. "What do I tell them?" he said. "The marshals. Tell them there's a county judge in Black Ridge using false testimony to imprison a rancher on murder charges, and that rancher has 22 years of documented evidence of land fraud, extortion, and at minimum one suspicious death that the same judge oversaw the non-investigation of." She took a breath. "Tell them the name Aldrich Holt. Tell them the names on Margaret's list: Sorrell, Beaumont, Chen, Rafe. Federal land office disputes are federal jurisdiction. They can't ignore that." Ethan nodded. "When do I leave?" "Tonight," she said. "After dark, before anyone's watching the North Road." She looked at him hard, at the line of his jaw and the set of his shoulders and the eyes that were his father's and something else that was entirely his own. "You come back with help, or you don't come back until you have it. Do you understand me?" "Yes, ma'am." She almost didn't say the next thing. She almost kept it practical. "I'm proud of you," she said instead. "I need you to know that before you go." His throat worked. He nodded once and looked away, and she let him, because some things needed a moment, and she understood that. She spent the rest of that afternoon moving evidence. She worked with Nora, who asked exactly 2 questions. What are we doing, and where does this go? And then executed both tasks with the quiet competence of someone who had decided that understanding the full picture could wait until the work was done. They moved the ledgers from the locked room in 3 trips, wrapped in burlap and packed into 2 saddlebags. Margaret's notes came out from behind the mantel. The original survey documents, the altered ones with the faint erasure lines, the folder of letters, the payment records, the land transfer documents, all of it went into the saddlebags. The saddlebags went with Ethan's gear. Tom Birch took the news with the stillness of a man who had been waiting for something like this for longer than he might have expected. "I was here when those families left," he said, when Evelyn told him about the land records. "The Sorrells. I was 17, worked a season for a rancher 2 properties over." He looked at the saddlebags on the barn floor. "I always thought there was something off about how fast they went. Will you go with Ethan?" "Yes." No hesitation, no calculation, just yes. "You understand it might be if Holt finds out what he's carrying." "I've been on this ranch 12 years, Mrs. Harper," Tom said. "I buried my wife 3 years ago, and I've got nowhere else to be. If this is what there is to do, then I'll do it." She thanked him the only way she knew how, which was directly and without performance. He seemed to appreciate that. "Dix," she kept. She explained enough to him. Not everything, but enough. He was 22 and easily flustered and loyal in the simple way of someone who hasn't yet been given reason to be otherwise. And she needed someone who could ride fast if fast was required. He accepted his role with the wide-eyed seriousness of a young man who very much wanted to be equal to a situation and wasn't entirely sure he was. "Stay close to the house," she told him. "If anyone comes up that road, you come in and tell me before you say anything to them. Anyone, even if it's someone you know." "Yes, ma'am." "And Dix, don't try to be brave in a way that gets you shot. Being smart is more useful right now." He blinked. "Yes, ma'am." Ethan and Tom left after full dark, with the saddlebags, 2 good horses, enough food for 3 days, and a letter in Ethan's coat written in Evelyn's hand that explained as clearly as she could make it in 2 pages the full shape of what Aldrich Holt had done and what she needed the federal authorities to understand. She had addressed it to the territorial marshal's office, but she'd also written, on a separate piece of paper, the name of a federal land commissioner she'd found referenced in one of Nathaniel Mercer's old correspondence, a man named Garfield Pruitt, who had apparently once had enough independent authority to make Nathaniel nervous. She didn't know if Pruitt was still alive or still in his position. It was a name, and names sometimes opened doors. She stood in the dark at the edge of the tree line and watched them go until the sound of the horses faded into the mountain dark. The temperature had dropped hard with the night, and her breath was visible, and she was wearing a coat over her nightgown over her day clothes because she hadn't bothered to undress since Cole was taken, and she was cold in a way that wasn't entirely about the weather. She went back inside. About. The deputies came the next morning. Not cousins. Two men she didn't know, riding with a third who carried papers in a leather satchel, with the self-important air of a man who does legal work and wants people to know it. They had a warrant to search the premises. She read it carefully, all of it, standing on the porch in the cold while the man with the satchel shifted his weight, and then she handed it back and stepped aside and let them in. There was no percentage in refusing a valid county warrant. Let them search. Let them find an empty locked room and a fireplace mantel with nothing behind it. What happened next was not exactly what she expected. The two deputies were thorough. She followed them through the house, not because she was legally entitled to, she wasn't sure if she was, but because she was a woman in her own home and she behaved as though that fact had weight, and neither of them challenged it. She kept her face neutral and her hands still, and she watched them go through every room, open every drawer, check behind every piece of furniture. They found nothing, because there was nothing to find. The man with the satchel looked at her on his way out with an expression she'd seen before. The expression of someone who expected to feel satisfaction and was instead feeling the low irritation of a plan that had gone sideways. "Mr. Mercer's property may be subject to additional review," he said. "I'd expect nothing less," she said pleasantly. "Good day, gentlemen." She closed the door. She stood with her back against it for a moment in the quiet of the house and let herself feel the shaking in her hands that she'd been suppressing for 20 minutes. Just for a moment, just until it passed. In the kitchen, Ruth appeared in the doorway. She was 12 years old and holding a rolling pin because she'd been making biscuits, and she looked at Evelyn with eyes that had seen the deputies arrive and depart and had drawn their own conclusions. "Did they find anything?" Ruth said. "No." Ruth nodded slowly. "Good," she said, and went back to her biscuits. The hard part started on the second day. She had not anticipated, or not fully anticipated, the particular difficulty of keeping 8 children calm in a house under siege when the siege had no visible face. There were no men at the gates, no obvious threat. Just the awareness of it, the knowledge that Cole was in a county jail on false charges, and Ethan was somewhere on a mountain road, and Holt had the county mechanism pointed at them like a gun they couldn't see clearly. Children, she had learned over 16 years, can absorb an enormous amount of reality if it's delivered to them honestly. What they cannot absorb is uncertainty. They can handle "this is hard and this is what we're doing about it." What breaks them down is "I don't know." So she told them, not the worst of it, not the parts about Margaret, not the parts about what Holt might do, but the frame of it. Cole had been taken by men who had lied, Ethan had gone to get help, and they were going to stay together and stay safe and do their work until that help arrived. Lily, who was 6, asked if Cole was going to die. Evelyn looked at her and said, "No, sweetheart, we're not going to let that happen." Lily accepted this with the gravity of a 6-year-old who understands more than she's given credit for. The twins, Pete and Sam, 9 years old, and constitutionally unable to sustain fear for more than a few minutes before it converted to energy, had turned the practical work of the ranch into something approaching a competition. Tom's absence meant the basic animal care fell to whoever was available, and they threw themselves into it with an intensity that Evelyn suspected was partly displacement of anxiety and partly genuine pride. She did not discourage it. Nora managed the inside of the house with a steadiness that Evelyn had to look away from sometimes, because it was too much like looking at herself at 14, which was a painful kind of recognition. The third night, she sat up late with the lamp low, and Cole's financial ledgers, the ones she'd kept back, the current operating records rather than the historical ones, and she did the ranch accounts. Not because it was the most pressing thing, because it was something she could control and finish and get right, and sometimes that's what keeps a person from unraveling. She was on the 3rd ledger page when she heard a horse on the road. One horse, moving carefully, not fast, the kind of movement that was deliberate. She went to the window. Dix was already on the porch. She'd heard him go out. He'd been sleeping light as a cat since Ethan left. She watched him stand at the edge of the porch rail in the dark, watching the road. The rider stopped at the gate. A woman's voice. "I'm looking for the Harper woman, Mrs. Evelyn Harper." Evelyn was out the door before she'd consciously decided to move. The rider was older, hard to tell exactly in the dark, but gray-haired, riding with the particular upright seat of someone who'd been on horses for 50 years. She was dressed practically, and her face in the faint moonlight had the quality of someone who had traveled somewhere they weren't sure was wise and had come anyway. "I'm Evelyn Harper," Evelyn said. The woman looked at her from the saddle. "My name is Clara Beaumont," she said. "I believe you wrote to my mother." A pause. "My mother passed 4 years ago. I opened her mail when the estate was settled, and I kept your letter. I kept the other one, too. The one from a man named Mercer about correcting historical records." Her voice had a dry edge to that last phrase. "I've been in Harlow for the past month visiting my cousin. When I heard what was happening out here, the arrest, the warrant, I thought—" She stopped. "I thought someone should come and see if there was something useful I could do." Evelyn stood in this cold night in front of her gate and looked up at this woman on a horse who had ridden out on uncertain ground because she thought there might be something useful she could do, and felt something shift in her chest that was partly relief and partly something older and harder to name. "Can you stay?" she said. "I brought enough for 3 days." "Come in," Evelyn said. "I'll put the horse up and make coffee, and you're going to tell me everything you know about what happened to your family's land." Clara Beaumont climbed down from the saddle with the stiffness of a long ride and looked at Evelyn in the dark with eyes that had the particular quality of someone who has been waiting a long time for a conversation and is no longer sure it's coming. "That'll take more than 3 days to tell properly," she said. "Start tonight," Evelyn said. "We may not have much of it." The night settled around the ranch, cold and still and enormous in the way of Montana nights. The stars enormous overhead, the mountains dark and close. Somewhere up in those mountains, Ethan was riding hard. Somewhere 3 miles south, Cole was sitting in a county jail that Aldrich Holt controlled, with a false witness and a bought judge lined up against him. And here, at a kitchen table lit by a low lamp, a woman who had survived being pushed off her family's land sat across from a woman who had refused to be pushed off someone else's, and they talked until the fire burned low and the coffee went cold, and what they built between them in those hours was the thing that Holt, with all his money and all his bought officials and all his years of careful architecture, had never thought to account for. 2 women who had nothing left to lose except the truth. And the truth, it turned out, was more than enough. Clara Beaumont slept in the room next to Nora's, and in the morning she was up before Evelyn, which Evelyn noted with the quiet approval of someone who measures people by what they do before anyone's watching. She found Clara at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a piece of paper she'd been writing on. Names, dates, a rough map drawn from memory. Clara looked up when Evelyn came in and pushed the paper across the table without preamble. "That's what I remember," Clara said. "My mother kept more. She had a box, letters, the original homestead filing, a survey her father commissioned in 1861 that contradicted the one Mercer's land agent filed in 1863. She kept it her whole life. When she died, I didn't know what to do with it, so I kept the box." Evelyn sat down and looked at the paper. "Where is it now?" "Harlow, my cousin's house." Clara wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. She was somewhere in her late 50s, with the kind of face that had been pretty once in a sharp-boned way and had become something better than pretty with time. Her eyes were direct and a little tired, the eyes of someone who had carried something for a long time and was cautiously hopeful about the possibility of setting it down. "I can send for it. My cousin could have it on a stage by day after tomorrow." "Do that," Evelyn said. "Today, if you can." Clara nodded, then, "How long has he been in that jail?" 3 days. "And the boy, your son?" 5 days on the road. Evelyn did the math she'd been doing every morning since Ethan left. "He should be in Gallatin by now, if the weather held on the pass." Clara looked at her steadily. "And if it didn't?" "Then he's a day behind," Evelyn said. "And I don't think about the other possibilities." Clara accepted this without pushing at it. She had the tact of someone who understood that some things were held together by not being examined too directly, and poking at them was not kindness. They were on the second cup of coffee when Dix knocked hard on the kitchen door and came in without waiting, which he had never done before, and Evelyn was on her feet before he got the words out. "Riders coming," he said. "A lot of them. From the South Road." She was at the window. 6. No, 8 riders, moving at a pace that was neither casual nor panicked, the deliberate pace of people with authority behind them. In front, Two men she didn't recognize riding with the particular bearing of men who wore badges as a matter of long habit rather than recent appointment. Federal, she thought. Federal, or she didn't know how to read a man on a horse. And behind them, on a gray horse she recognized because she'd helped Tom saddle it 5 days ago. Ethan. She was on the porch before she knew she'd moved. Clara came out behind her. Dix was already at the porch rail, shading his eyes against the morning glare. Ethan rode in front of the group as they came through the gate, and she could see from 50 yards that he was exhausted. The particular hollowed-out look of someone who had pushed through sleep and come out the other side of it into a state that was running purely on forward momentum. His coat was muddy at the shoulders. He had a cut on his chin that had been roughly cleaned. His eyes, when they found her on the porch, went through several things in quick succession. Relief, and something harder than relief, a kind of arrived pride that she recognized because she'd felt it herself in moments when she'd done something she wasn't sure she could do. He pulled up at the porch steps and looked down at her. "I brought help," he said. His voice was rougher than usual, road-worn. "I can see that." She kept her voice steady. She could fall apart later. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine." The pass was iced. Tom's horse went down. "He's okay. The horse is okay. It took us most of a day to deal with it." He looked like he wanted to say more about that and had decided to save it. "Ma, this is Marshal Dowd, federal. And there's a land commissioner, Pruitt, Garfield Pruitt." He was still there. He'd already been looking at Holt. The lead rider had come up alongside Ethan, a lean man in his 50s with a clipped gray mustache and the specific economy of movement of someone who had spent decades not wasting anything. He looked at Evelyn on the porch and touched the brim of his hat. "Mrs. Harper," he said, "I'm Deputy Marshal Callum Dowd. I've been riding with Commissioner Pruitt out of Gallatin." He paused. "Your son is a persistent young man." "He gets it from his father," she said. It came out before she'd decided to say it, and it was true. The persistence was Thomas, whatever else Ethan had taken from her. Dowd nodded. "We had a report through our own channels about Holt 6 weeks ago. Incomplete. Didn't know what we were looking at yet. What your son brought us filled in a significant number of gaps." He looked at the ranch house, then back at her. "Is the evidence currently on the property?" "No," she said. "It's with your marshals." A very slight shift in his expression. Approval, maybe. Or simply the recognition that she'd done something smart. "Then we have what we need to move on Holt today. I'll need statements from you and anyone else with direct knowledge." "The woman on the porch." "Clara Beaumont," Clara said from behind Evelyn. "My family's land is in those records. I have additional documentation coming from Harlow." Dowd looked at her with a focused attention that said he was already filing her as a witness. "We'll need that documentation." "You'll have it." He turned back to Evelyn. "Cole Mercer is still in the county jail on a county warrant. My authority supersedes Cousins's, but I need to do this right. No procedural holes that Holt can push through later. We'll go to the jail first, then the courthouse." "I want to come," Evelyn said. Dowd considered her for a moment. "This could get complicated." "I've been managing complicated for 2 weeks," she said. "I know more about what's in those documents than anyone except Cole and possibly Tom Birch. If you have questions that need answers in the moment, you want me there." Another small pause. Then, "All right." She turned to Clara. "The children? I have them," Clara said, simply, without being asked twice, without making it a negotiation. "Go." Awashasam. Black Ridge on a Thursday morning looked more or less like Black Ridge on any other morning. The main street going about its business. The saloon not yet open. Gus Howell sweeping the general store porch with the habitual air of a man who sweeps because the hour requires it, and not because he's especially enthusiastic about the project. He stopped sweeping when the riders came in. 8 federal riders, 2 of them bearing clear marshal stars, plus Ethan, plus Evelyn, coming up the main street at a pace that was not dramatic but was deliberate. The pace of people who knew where they were going and were going there. Evelyn watched the street change as they passed through it. The woman who had shaken her head at her on the day she'd arrived stopped mid-step near the post office. The 2 men at the livery stopped working again, same as before, but their faces were different now. People came out of buildings the way they do when something is happening, not wanting to be visible but not wanting to miss it either. The county jail was a stone building behind the courthouse, which itself was the largest structure on the main street. 2 stories, brick, with a flagpole that needed a new rope. Cousins was on the courthouse steps when they came around the corner, talking to the man with the satchel she'd seen 3 days ago. And he stopped mid-sentence and went very still. Dowd pulled up in front of the steps and looked down at him. "Sheriff Cousins." Cousins looked at the stars on Dowd's coat, and then at the riders behind him, and then at Evelyn, who held his gaze without expression. Something moved through his face that was complicated. Not fear exactly, more the look of a man watching a calculation he'd made come out wrong. "Marshal," he said carefully, "I have a federal warrant superseding the county arrest warrant on Cole Mercer. I need him released immediately." Dowd reached into his coat and held out the paper. "I also have a federal warrant for the arrest of Aldrich Holt on charges of extortion, land fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of Federal Land Commission authority. I'll need to know his present location." The man with the satchel had gone the color of old paper. Cousins looked at the warrant in Dowd's hand for a long moment. He was doing something internal. She could almost see it. The same math she'd watched him do on her porch, weighing what he'd been asked to do against what it was going to cost him. He took the warrant, read it, folded it, looked up at Dowd. "Judge Holt is in his chambers," he said. "Second floor. And—" He stopped. The next words appeared to cost him something. "Garrett Flood is in the holding cell next to Mercer's. He came in 2 nights ago claiming he needed protective custody. I think he was having second thoughts about his testimony." Dowd nodded. "I'll want to speak with him. The keys to Mercer's cell are in my office." Cousins stepped back from the steps. "I'll get them." Evelyn climbed down from the horse. Ethan was beside her. He'd been beside her since they left the ranch, in the quiet, close way of someone who intends to see a thing through to its end. "You should wait out here," she said. "I'm coming in." She looked at him. He was 16 years old, and he had ridden 2.5 days through mountain terrain in bad weather, carrying evidence that could destroy a powerful man, and he was still on his feet. She didn't have the heart, or, honestly, the standing, to tell him no. "Stay close," she said. "Sec." Cole came out of the cell looking like 3 days in a county jail. Looked unshaved, tired, wearing the same clothes he'd had on when they took him, with a stillness about him that said he'd been spending the time managing himself carefully and was holding that management together with some effort. He looked at Dowd first, then at Ethan, and then at Evelyn, and what crossed his face in that sequence was something she filed away in a place she didn't examine in public. "You sent him," Cole said. His voice was rough. "He went," she said. "There's a difference." Cole looked at Ethan, who was standing slightly behind Evelyn's left shoulder in a way that was protective without being aggressive, instinctive, the posture of a boy who had been the oldest male in a household for 8 months and had settled into the weight of it. "You all right, son?" Cole said. Ethan blinked. He was tired enough that the word landed on him without the usual defenses up, and she saw him absorb it, not uncomfortably, but with the particular care of someone receiving something they hadn't expected. "Yeah," he said. "Got a cut on my chin. Tom's horse went down on the pass, but—" "Tom?" Cole looked at Evelyn sharply. "He's fine," she said. "He's outside with the horses. He'll want to tell you about it himself, I imagine." Cole let out a breath. His shoulders came down slightly, a small physical release, the kind a person makes when they've been holding something without knowing it. He looked at the open cell door and the narrow stone corridor and then back at her. "You found someone to ride with him." "I found a lot of things while you were in here," she said. "Claire Beaumont is at the ranch with the children right now. Holt's records are with Marshal Dowd. We have testimony, we have documents, and we have a federal land commissioner who was already building a case before Ethan walked in the door." Cole was quiet for a moment. "Clara Beaumont," he said slowly. "From the list." "From the list." He looked at her with an expression she had been seeing develop for 2 weeks, an expression she understood the shape of, even if she wasn't entirely ready to name what it was. "You did all of this," he said, "while managing 8 children and whatever else Holt sent." "Dick's helped," she said, "and Ruth is more capable than you've had time to notice." He almost smiled at that, the same way he almost smiled at things sometimes, the smile arriving partway and stopping, as though it wasn't sure it had permission yet. "We need to talk," he said, "about a number of things." We will, she said. Later. Right now, Dowd is upstairs arresting your judge. Cole straightened. I want to be there. I thought you might. Aldrich Holt's chambers were what she'd have predicted from everything she'd learned about him. Substantial, well-furnished, the furnishings chosen to communicate permanence and authority. A large desk, bookshelves with law volumes that had the look of being arranged rather than read. A window overlooking the main street that gave him a view of everything coming and going in Black Ridge, which was probably not an accident in the original design. He was at his desk when Dowd came through the door with two marshals behind him, and his face did something she watched with a cold, focused attention she hadn't expected to feel. He was in his 60s, heavier than she'd imagined, with a white-haired solidity that had probably read as impressive for decades, and now read as something that was about to be picked up and moved. He looked at Dowd, at the marshals. His eyes moved to Cole in the doorway, and stayed there, in the way of someone doing a rapid recalculation of a plan that had just lost its foundation. Then his eyes found Evelyn. She hadn't intended to stand in his line of sight. It wasn't strategic. She was simply where she was, in the doorway behind Cole, and Holt's gaze landed on her and stayed. Judge Holt, Dowd said, setting the warrant on his desk. Federal arrest warrant. You'll want to read that. Holt looked at the warrant. He didn't touch it. He looked at it with the expression of a man who already knows what it says and is deciding how to respond, which option preserves the most, which route out of the room still has the door open. On whose testimony? He said. His voice was controlled. We have documentary evidence from the Mercer Ranch records, Dowd said. Correspondence, payment ledgers, land transfer documents. We also have a statement from Garrett Flood, who has agreed to testify in exchange for consideration on lesser charges. A pause. And we have direct testimony from Clara Beaumont, whose family was among those displaced by the land arrangements you administered. Something happened in Holt's face at Clara Beaumont's name. Not fear. It was past fear, something flatter and colder, the expression of a man absorbing an outcome he'd considered possible for years and had wagered he could prevent. He picked up the warrant. Read it. Set it down with the particular care of someone who has run out of moves and doesn't want that to be visible. I'll need my attorney, he said. You can contact your attorney from federal custody, Dowd said. One of the marshals moved to the desk. Holt stood, slowly, with the dignity of a man who intends to be arrested as though it's his idea, and allowed his hands to be secured. He walked toward the door without looking at Cole. As he passed Evelyn, his eyes went to her briefly, the rapid assessing look she'd felt on the first day in town when she'd been invisible to him. She looked back steadily and said nothing. He went through the door with a marshal on each side, and the chambers felt different the moment he left them. Lighter, she thought, though that was probably too simple a word for it. Cole stood in the middle of the room and looked at the desk, the bookshelves, the window. He had his hands at his sides and his face was difficult to read. Not blank, but layered. Multiple things happening at once that hadn't finished sorting themselves out. Cole, she said quietly. He turned. It's not over, she said. There's still the federal proceedings. It'll take time. He'll have lawyers, and there'll be hearings, and it won't be— I know, he said. I know that. He looked at the window, at the main street below, where two of the marshals had emerged from the courthouse, with Holt between them, and a crowd had begun to collect, with the instinctive gravity that crowds have around significant moments. I've been looking at that door on this room for 3 years, since I understood what my father did, what Holt covered. He stopped. I didn't know what was on the other side of it. She waited. Margaret knew, he said. She was the one who started looking. She handed me those records and said something was wrong, and I told her to leave it, that I'd handle it, that it wasn't— He stopped. I told her to leave it. The room was quiet. Downstairs, footsteps and voices, the organized movement of federal authority going about its business. Outside, the crowd had grown. You didn't know what she'd found yet, Evelyn said. I knew enough to know it was dangerous. She didn't argue with that. He was right, and he'd been carrying it for 14 months, and the right thing was not to soften it, but to let him have the truth of it. You can't go back, she said. You know that. But you can do what Margaret's list said. Find where they went, find what was owed. That's something you can actually do. He looked at her. With your help? She held his gaze. If that's still what you want. Evelyn. He said her name the way she'd said his 2 weeks ago. The first time, deliberate, the sound of someone deciding to use the real thing instead of the formal distance. What I want is complicated and probably inconvenient to explain right now. Then explain it later, she said, when things are quieter. When things are quieter, he agreed. Flood's testimony, given in a formal statement to Marshal Dowd that afternoon in the courthouse conference room, was not what any of them had expected. He had not, as it turned out, witnessed Cole harm Margaret. He had witnessed something else entirely, a conversation between Holt and a man named Terrence Dole 3 days after Margaret's death, in which Holt had made clear that Dole's debt, a substantial sum owed to Holt's land company, would be forgiven in exchange for testimony attesting to an altercation if the case against Cole was ever formally reopened. Dole had agreed. Flood had been president because he regularly met with Holt's man in Black Ridge, and had arrived at the wrong moment and learned more than he was meant to. He had spent 6 years, he said, not knowing what to do with what he knew. Holt had paid him to stay on the ranch, not explicitly, not in a way that could be documented, but there had been extra income with no clear source, and Flood was not stupid about what it meant. When Evelyn had arrived and started asking about records and looking in places that made him uncomfortable, he'd sent word to Holt. When Holt had moved against Cole, Flood had saddled his horse and headed for Gallatin, not to deliver testimony against Cole, as they had assumed, but because he decided that whichever way it fell, being in Black Ridge when it happened was not where he wanted to be. He was, Evelyn concluded, a man who had spent 6 years making the small coward's choice, not evil, just unwilling, and had finally arrived at the edge of something he couldn't make himself do. It wasn't admirable, but it was human in the messy way that human things were. And it had put him in Gallatin with information that, added to everything else, closed the remaining gaps in the case against Holt. She didn't feel generous toward him, but she didn't feel the need to hate him either. The man named Dole, when 2 marshals brought him in from whatever he'd been doing on a Thursday afternoon in Black Ridge, lasted approximately 20 minutes under questioning before he gave them everything he knew, which included the name of a third man, a county clerk named Siebert, who had altered the land survey documents in 1863 and again in several subsequent years, and who was now 67 years old and, as it turned out, had been waiting to tell someone about it for a decade and a half. Siebert talked for 2 hours. What emerged from those 2 hours was not just the Mercer Ranch story. It was bigger than that, which she'd suspected but hadn't known the shape of. Holt had been operating the same arrangement with 2 other large landholders in the territory, both now deceased, whose heirs were either unaware of the origins of their property or had chosen not to look. The land fraud extended to at least 11 families over a period of 20 years. Margaret's list had named 4. The real number was nearly 3 times that. Dowd brought Evelyn and Cole together in the conference room at the end of the afternoon and laid it out for them, carefully, the way a man lays out something with complicated weight. The federal case against Holt is solid, he said. Extortion, land fraud, abuse of judicial authority. The murder question, he paused. The murder question is harder. We can establish motive. We can establish that Flood reported to Holt and that Holt moved against Cole immediately after. But direct evidence of what happened to Margaret, we may not be able to prove it to the criminal standard. Cole's jaw tightened. Evelyn watched him manage it. What does that mean for him? Cole said. It means he goes to federal prison on the charges we can prove, which, based on what Siebert gave us today, will keep him there for the rest of his life. Dowd looked at him steadily. I know that's not the same as the other thing. No, Cole said. It isn't. Cole, Evelyn said. He looked at her. Margaret's list, she said. What she wrote at the top, find where they went, find what was owed. She kept her voice quiet but even. She wasn't writing about punishment. She was writing about restoration, about the families. She watched him take that in. That's what you can do. That's what she was trying to do. The conference room was small and smelled of old paper and recent coffee and the particular staleness of a building that had housed bad decisions for too long. Outside the window, the main street of Black Ridge had gone on with the ordinary business of late afternoon. Horses, foot traffic, the bang of that broken saloon shutter in the wind. Cole looked at the window for a moment. Then he looked at Evelyn and something in him settled. Not resolved, not finished with its grief, but oriented, pointed somewhere. The Sorrel family, he said. The Beaumonts. The others on Siebert's list. He looked at Dowd. What does it take to begin returning land? Legally. Dowd blinked. Just slightly. The blink of a man who had expected several possible next statements, and not this one. It's a process, he said carefully. The Federal Land Commission would need to review each claim. Some of the families may not have living descendants. Some of the land will have changed hands legitimately in the interim, and untangling that, I'm not asking if it's easy, Cole said. I'm asking what it takes. Dowd looked at him for a moment, and then at Evelyn, and then back. It takes someone willing to cooperate fully with the Commission and willing to voluntarily surrender claims where the original acquisition was fraudulent. He paused. That's not nothing. Most people in your position would fight it. I'm not most people in my position, Cole said. Evelyn said nothing. She didn't need to. By evening, the news had done what news does in a small town. Spread, transformed, taken on the particular texture of a story that people would tell differently depending on who they were and where they'd been standing when it happened. Gus Howell came to the courthouse with his hat in his hands and stood in the hallway for 20 minutes before Evelyn noticed him and went to find out what he wanted. I knew, he said when she got to him. He looked at the floor and then at her. Not everything, but enough. I knew there was something wrong with how Mercer's father built that ranch, and I never asked because Holt held my building note, and I didn't. He stopped. I know, she said. That's not enough. No, she agreed. But it's where you start. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had been hoping for either absolution or condemnation and had gotten something harder, which was just accuracy. He nodded, put his hat back on, and went back out into the evening. She found Ethan on the courthouse steps, sitting with his elbows on his knees and his eyes closed, catching the last thin warmth of the afternoon sun before it dropped behind the mountains. He opened his eyes when she sat beside him. Tom wants to sleep for a week, he said. He's earned it. So have you. He looked at her sideways. You're not going to, though. Not yet. She looked at the main street. A few people had nodded to her as she'd moved through the building this afternoon, cautious, recalibrating, people readjusting their understanding of what had happened and who she was in it. She didn't need their approval, but it was different from the pity she'd arrived to, and the difference mattered. How are you? He thought about it with the seriousness of a 16-year-old who had been asked that question genuinely and intended to give a genuine answer. Tired, he said. That was a hard ride. The pass was bad. When Tom's horse went down, I thought... He stopped. I was scared for a while. Good, she said. He looked at her. If you weren't scared, I'd be more worried, she said. Scared means you understood what was at stake. He was quiet for a moment. Do you think it worked? Really? Like, Holt's going to go to prison and Cole gets out and it's not just anything, she said. It'll be a long process and there'll be lawyers and court hearings and it won't be clean. She looked at him. But the foundation is broken. What he built, the way he held this territory, that's done. Even if every piece of the legal process takes years, the mechanism he used to run it doesn't work anymore. Ethan nodded slowly. The sun touched the mountain line and the light went from gold to gray in the abrupt way it did in this country, the warmth dropping out of it all at once. Pa would have liked this, Ethan said. Quietly. Not directed at her particularly. Just a thing that was true and needed to be said. She felt it in the way she always felt it. That particular pressure behind the sternum that was grief doing what grief did, arriving when the immediate danger had passed and there was suddenly room for it. She didn't push it away. She let it be there for a moment, sitting on the courthouse steps with her son and the fading light. Yes, she said. He would have. They sat there until the street lamps were lit and the night came down cold and clear over Black Ridge, and in the morning there would be statements to give and documents to file, and a long road back to something that wasn't quite what it had been before, but might, with enough work and enough honesty, become something worth the cost of getting here. But that was morning. For now there was the cold air and the stars coming out above the mountains, and her son sitting beside her, alive and home, and the knowledge, quiet and solid as the courthouse stone under them, that the worst of it was done. Not finished, not clean, but done. The box from Harlow arrived on a Wednesday, 4 days after Holt was taken to Gallatin in federal custody. Clara Beaumont's cousin had packed it carefully, wrapped in oilcloth, tied with cord, the kind of packing that said someone understood they were handling something that mattered. Clara opened it at the kitchen table of the Mercer Ranch with Evelyn beside her and Cole standing near the window, and what came out of it was the accumulated evidence of a family that had refused to forget what had been taken from them, even when forgetting would have been easier. The original homestead filing, dated 1861, signed by Clara's grandfather Robert Beaumont, in handwriting that had the careful deliberateness of a man who didn't write often and understood the weight of what he was signing. The survey her grandfather had commissioned, hand-drawn, precise, showing boundary lines that contradicted the Mercer land agent's official filing by nearly 400 acres. Letters between Robert Beaumont and a territorial official in 1864, in which Beaumont described being told his claim was invalid, his survey incorrect, his options limited to accepting a fraction of what he was owed or losing everything. And at the bottom of the box, wrapped separately in a piece of flannel, a photograph, small and faded, of a family in front of a cabin. A man, a woman, 4 children of varying heights, squinting into the sun. Clara held it for a long time without saying anything. "That's the cabin," she said finally. "My mother described it to me. She was the youngest. She was 3 when they left. She said she remembered the sound the creek made." She set the photograph down on the table with the careful placement of someone returning something to its rightful position. She talked about that creek her whole life, said it had a particular sound, different from other creeks. I always thought she was that grief does that to things, makes them specific. Maybe it does, Evelyn said. Doesn't mean the sound wasn't real. Clara looked at her. The morning light through the kitchen window was the thin, clear light of late autumn, the kind that made everything look a little more itself than usual. "Is the creek still there?" Cole answered from the window. "South drainage runs year-round." He paused. "The cabin's gone. The foundation's still there, if you know where to look." Clara nodded slowly. She touched the edge of the photograph and then moved her hand away. "I don't want the land back," she said. "I want you to know that before anything else gets decided. I'm too old to ranch and I've got a life in Harlow. But I want it acknowledged that it happened, that my grandfather built something here and it was taken, and it happened because the system was designed to let it happen." She looked at Cole directly. "I want that on record somewhere that doesn't disappear when the right people stop paying attention to it." "It will be," Cole said. He pushed off from the window and came to the table and sat down. Not the careful, managed movement she'd seen in the early days, the way he'd moved when he was braced for things, but something more settled, less like a man walking into a room he wasn't sure was safe. Commissioner Pruitt's office is building a formal record of each case, written, filed with the Federal Land Commission, entered into the permanent territorial record. Every family, every claim, what was taken, and under what circumstances. He looked at Clara. "Your grandfather's name will be in it, your mother's name. Yours, if you want." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yes, I want." The formal process of what Cole had agreed to do, cooperating with the Federal Land Commission to untangle the fraudulent acquisitions going back 22 years, turned out to be exactly as complicated as Dowd had warned, and no more sentimental than a land survey, which was to say that it involved a great deal of paperwork, and a great deal of waiting, and several trips to Gallatin, and one occasion when a territorial attorney tried to explain to Evelyn why certain portions of the Mercer Reach couldn't technically be considered fraudulently acquired given the elapsed time. And Evelyn listened to this explanation in its entirety before laying out, in specific and patient detail, exactly why she disagreed and which documents supported her disagreement, until the attorney stopped talking and wrote something down. Cole had been present for that exchange and had said nothing during it. And afterward, riding back toward Black Ridge in the late afternoon cold, had looked at her sideways and said, "You've done that before." "Done what?" "Talked someone out of their own argument using their own materials." "I've had children for 16 years, she said. You learn how to use the available resources." He almost laughed. It was becoming a more regular occurrence, that almost laugh. The thing that stopped just short of full and then stayed in his face a little longer each time. She had stopped noting it privately as progress, and had started simply accepting it as part of how he was, which felt like its own kind of progress. The 11 families on Siebert's extended list were at various stages of traceable. 4 had descendants who could be located and who participated in the commission process. The Beaumonts, obviously, and a family named Rafe, whose grandson ran a hardware store in Butte and came to Gallatin twice to give testimony with the expression of a man who had not expected, at 41, to be handed back something he'd never known was owed to him. The Chen family was the hardest. Wei Chen at the Gallatin Assay office had not responded to Cole's letter and had not responded to Evelyn's letter and did not respond to a formal notice from the commission, and for 3 weeks it seemed like that thread would simply not pull. Then one morning in December, a man appeared at the ranch gate on a mule. He was somewhere around 50, slight, with the watchful self-containment of someone who had spent a lifetime being the only person of his kind in various rooms and had made a particular peace with it. He looked at Evelyn on the porch for a moment and said, "I'm Wei Chen. I got your letters." "All of them," she said. "All of them." He didn't apologize for not responding, which she respected. "I wasn't sure what you wanted. I wrote what I wanted in the second letter. People say things in letters they don't mean when it comes to actually doing them." "That's fair," she said. "Come inside. I'll show you the documents." He came inside. He looked at the documents. His grandfather's original homestead filing, the altered survey with the erasure marks, the payment ledger entries. With the systematic attention of a man who worked in an assay office and was accustomed to evaluating evidence for what it actually showed rather than what someone claimed it showed. He spent 40 minutes going through everything without saying much. Then he looked up. "What exactly are you offering?" he said. Cole, sitting across the table, answered directly. 160 acres in the East Creek drainage. That's what the original filing covered. The land is currently being used for seasonal grazing. I'll relocate that. He paused. "Or I can offer the fair market value in cash if you'd rather have that. The commission has assessed it. It's your choice." Wei Chen looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" Cole didn't answer that immediately. He looked at his hands, then back at Wei Chen, with the expression of someone who has thought about an answer a great deal and still isn't entirely sure it's enough. "Because it was yours," he said. "And then it wasn't. Because my father paid the right men to make it not be. And I can't undo that, but I can. I can do this much." "Your father did it," Wei Chen said. "Not you." "The land was in my name when I inherited it," Cole said. "That makes it my responsibility to fix." Wei Chen was quiet for a long time. The kitchen sounds went on around them. Clara somewhere in the back part of the house with the younger children, the twins audible outside in the way they always were, a sound like distant minor disasters being narrowly averted. "My grandfather built a house on that creek," Wei Chen said finally. He said something in Cantonese that Evelyn didn't understand. It means something like, the place where water remembers. He said the creek had a particular sound. He looked at the window. My mother used to say that. Said her father told her before he died that he'd had a piece of land once where the water had a voice. The kitchen was very quiet. Evelyn thought about Clara saying the same thing, that her mother had talked about the creek's sound her whole life. 2 families pushed off the same land or land nearby, carrying the same specific loss in different languages for 60 years. The particular cruelty of that hit her somewhere precise and undefended. "Take the land," she said. She hadn't planned to speak. It came out of something below planning. "You don't have to build on it or live on it or do anything with it, but take it back. Put your grandfather's name on it." Wei Chen looked at her, then at Cole. Cole nodded once. "All right," Wei Chen said. "I'll take the land." Holt's trial was in February in federal court in Gallatin and lasted 11 days. Evelyn attended 3 of them, the days when her testimony was required, and one additional day that she attended because she wanted to see it happen, to be in the room when the full shape of it was formally established and entered into a record that would outlast all of them. The outcome was not in serious doubt once Siebert's testimony was entered and corroborated by Flood's account of the conversation between Holt and the man named Dole. Holt's attorney argued that the land arrangements predated his client's judicial appointment and that his client had simply administered existing arrangements rather than originated them, which was not untrue but was also not, as the federal prosecutor pointed out with considerable precision, a defense against extortion. Holt was convicted on 7 counts. He was sentenced to federal prison. The sentence was long enough that the question of when he might leave it was largely academic. She watched him leave the courtroom between 2 federal marshals and felt not what she'd expected to feel. She'd thought it would be larger, more satisfying in a clean way. Instead, it was quiet, the particular quiet of a thing that has been finished but not undone. Holt was going to prison. Margaret was still dead. The families who'd lost their land had lost 60 years they couldn't recover. None of that changed because a man in a courtroom said the right words in the right order. But it was something. It was the difference between a wound that's been left open and one that has been imperfectly closed. She had learned to respect that difference. Outside the courthouse, Cole was waiting on the steps. He'd been in the room for the verdict and had left just after, and she found him standing with his coat collar up against the February wind, looking at the street below. She stood beside him. "Done," she said. "Done," he agreed. They were quiet for a moment. Below them, Gallatin went about its business. Wagons, foot traffic, the ordinary noise of a city that had its own concerns and would absorb this trial into its history, the way cities absorbed everything without stopping. "I keep thinking about what I should feel," Cole said, "and what I actually feel is mostly tired." "That's appropriate," Evelyn said. "Tired means you've been carrying something heavy. It doesn't mean you carried it wrong." He looked at her sideways. "Where do you get these things?" "Experience," she said, "and a general reluctance to let suffering have the last word." He was quiet for another moment. The wind came off the mountains with the particular bite of February, the kind of cold that found every gap in a coat and was not apologetic about it. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know that whatever you answer, nothing changes about the arrangement as it stands. You and the children have a home at the ranch for as long as you want it. That's not contingent on anything." She waited. "I want to know if you'd consider actually marrying me, not the arrangement, not the practical thing." He was looking at the street, not at her, with the slightly stiff posture of a man who has worked himself up to saying something and is now committed to getting through it. We've known each other 2 months, and I know I know you had a marriage that was real, and I'm not asking you to replace that. I'm asking something different. I'm asking if you think there's a version of this where we're... He stopped. "I'm asking badly." "Yes," she said. He stopped. "You're asking badly," she said, "but yes to the actual question." He looked at her. She looked back at him, at the angular, weathered face that had become familiar in the specific way that people's faces became familiar when you'd seen them afraid and angry and exhausted and trying and close to losing it and not losing it, which was more intimacy than most formal introductions managed in 2 months. "Yes," he said carefully. Which part was yes? "Both," she said. "You were asking badly, and yes, I'll marry you, the real version." Something came into his face that she thought might take a while to name properly. Not just the almost laugh, but something deeper and less defended, the expression of a man who had gotten very practiced at not hoping for things, and had been caught hoping for this one anyway. "All right," he said. His voice was a little rough. "All right." "Don't make it a bigger moment than it is," she said. "We're standing outside a federal courthouse in February, and my feet are cold." He did laugh then, fully, which she hadn't heard before, and it was a good sound, the kind that came from somewhere real rather than somewhere polite. "We can go inside," he said. "There's a hotel on the next block." "Good," she said. "I want coffee, and I want to sit down, and I want to start talking about the spring calving schedule, because it's 6 weeks out and we haven't organized the crew properly since Tom's been recovering." He looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between amazed and deeply unsurprised. "That's what you want to talk about?" "That's the ranch," she said. "It doesn't stop because we had a feeling." They went inside. Spring came to Black Ridge the way spring came to that country. Not gradually, but in a series of negotiations between Winter and everything else, with Winter conceding ground one hard day at a time, and then occasionally taking it back just to make the point that it was leaving on its own terms. The Mercer Reach in April looked different than it had in November. Partly the season, the grass coming up through the old snow-flattened brown, the creek running fast and loud with snowmelt, the sky a particular blue that existed only at altitude in that first real warmth of spring, but partly something else, something harder to name that was about the people moving through it. Tom Birch had recovered from the fall on the pass with the stoic competence of a man who had recovered from worse and didn't see the point in making a production of it, though Evelyn had noticed he favored his left shoulder in cold weather and pretended not to when he thought anyone was watching. He had, in the months since Winter, taken on a kind of unofficial uncle role with the older boys that nobody had planned and everybody had accepted, the way useful arrangements sometimes establish themselves without needing to be discussed. Dix had turned 23 in March and had, at some point during the winter, quietly begun a correspondence with a girl in Black Ridge, whose name Evelyn learned by accident and whose existence Dix confirmed with the deep embarrassment of someone who hadn't yet realized that the people around him were not going to be cruel about it. Evelyn had told him she hoped it went well and left it at that. The twins had become, under Tom's careful guidance and their own competitive instincts, genuinely useful with the horses in the way that 9-year-old boys sometimes were when they were given real work and real responsibility. Not the performed usefulness of children kept busy, but actual competence, the kind that showed up unprompted because they'd internalized the standard. They were still catastrophic in other respects. The south fence had twice been left open by persons who claimed not to have been the last through it. Evelyn had addressed this at dinner with sufficient precision that it had not happened a third time. Ruth turned 13 in March and asked, as her primary birthday request, if she could have her own shelf in the study for books, which Cole had agreed to before Evelyn could answer and had then spent most of a Saturday afternoon constructing with more care than strictly necessary, which Ruth observed with the quiet satisfaction of a girl who had been taken seriously. Lily had lost 2 teeth in January and gained a friend in the daughter of a ranching family 3 miles south, and the two of them conducted a friendship of the elaborate, rule-governed kind that 6-year-olds developed, which required regular renegotiation of terms and produced occasional diplomatic incidents that Evelyn mediated with the patience of someone who understood that childhood friendships were essentially small governments learning to function. Clara was the question Evelyn hadn't expected. Clara Beaumont, who had arrived on a horse in the night with a box of her family's history and a willingness to do something useful, had gone back to Harlow in January to settle things there and had reappeared in March with a wagon and most of her possessions in a manner that suggested she had made a decision that she wasn't going to perform uncertainty about. "I'd like to stay," she said, on the porch, on a Tuesday afternoon. "If there's room." Evelyn looked at her. "You left Harlow." "I had a room there and a cousin who is fond of me but doesn't need me." Clara looked at the ranch house and the mountains behind it with the expression of someone seeing a place as it is rather than as it appears. "I spent 60 years with my mother's loss. This is the closest I've been to where it came from. I'm not ready to leave it." "You don't have to explain yourself," Evelyn said. "I know. I'm explaining anyway." She looked at Evelyn directly. "I'm not looking to be kept. I can work. I'm good with the younger children, and I can help with the accounts. I ran my husband's business for 11 years before he died. I know what I'm worth." Evelyn thought about a woman who had kept a box of documents for 40 years because she understood that things needed to be witnessed, even when the witnessing cost something. She thought about a woman who had ridden out on a dark night to an unknown ranch because there might be something useful she could do. "There's a room on the east side," she said. "Gets morning sun. It's been empty since we reorganized the children's rooms in January." Clara nodded once, the nod of someone who doesn't make more of an agreement than it needs to be. "Good." She stayed. It worked, in the unsentimental way that practical arrangements between capable people sometimes worked. Not perfectly, not without friction, but with the steady functionality of people who had each figured out what they were doing and did it. The wedding was in May, on a Saturday, in the main room of the ranch house because neither of them wanted the church in town, and because the room was large enough and the day was warm enough to open the front doors onto the porch and let the spring air in. It was not a large ceremony. Dowd came down from Gallatin because he'd said he would, and was the kind of man who kept that kind of promise. Tom Birch wore a clean shirt and a tie that he'd clearly borrowed from someone and wasn't comfortable in but had worn anyway, as a gesture of respect. Dix arrived with the girl from Black Ridge, whose name was May, and who turned out to be sensible and direct in a way that confirmed Evelyn's estimation of his taste. Gus Howell came, which she hadn't expected, and stood near the back with his hat in his hands and the specific look of a man trying to do better than he'd done before. A few others from town who had, over the months, moved from wariness to something like ordinary neighborliness. The woman from the post office, the family from the ranch to the south, whose daughter was Lily's friend. Clara stood near the fireplace with the younger children gathered loosely around her, which had become a natural configuration over the months. Ethan stood beside Evelyn. He had grown an inch since November, which she'd noted and not mentioned because 17-year-old boys didn't need their mothers measuring them publicly. He was wearing the good jacket she'd let out at the seams last month, and he had combed his hair with the deliberateness of someone who had decided to take the occasion seriously. "You ready?" he said. Quietly, just to her. She looked at him. She thought about a boy who had held things together after his father died, who had ridden into the mountains in the dark with evidence in his saddlebags because she'd asked him to. She thought about the expression on his face when Cole had called him son in that jail corridor, the unguarded way he'd absorbed it, the careful way he'd looked away. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" He thought about it. "He's a good man," he said. It came out simple and considered, the verdict of someone who had been watching carefully and had made up his own mind. "He's not Pa, but he tries to do right, even when it's hard. That's not nothing." "No," she said, "it isn't." "And he listens to you," Ethan said. "Pa did too, but not everyone does, I noticed." She looked at her son for a moment longer than the moment required, and then she said, "Let's go." And they walked into the main room together. The ceremony was brief and direct and conducted by a justice of the peace from Black Ridge, who had recently been appointed to replace the position Holtz County machinery had previously controlled, and who read the words with the plain competence of someone who understood that what he was witnessing didn't need ornamentation. When it was done, Cole looked at her with the particular attention he had, that bridge-testing look that had shifted over months into something that was just how he looked at her, the full weight of it without the caution. And she looked back, and neither of them said anything that needed to be said in front of other people. Pete knocked over a chair getting to the food table, and Sam blamed him, and Lily announced to the room that she'd seen this coming, and Clara intercepted the dispute with the efficiency of a woman who had been managing small disasters for months and had developed a reliable method, and the room went on around them in the good noise of people who had gotten somewhere hard together and were, for the moment, simply being somewhere. Mates. In June, Evelyn found herself standing at the edge of the East Creek drainage on a Tuesday morning with nothing particular to do, which was a condition so rare in her life that it took her a moment to recognize it. The creek ran fast with the last of the snowmelt, clear over the rounded stones of its bed, making the particular sound that two separate families had carried with them for 60 years without being able to explain why they couldn't let it go. She stood and listened to it and understood now that she was here that it wasn't a sound that translated into words. It was a sound that meant something prior to words. The sound of water moving over a specific bed of stones in a specific valley under a specific sky. The sound that said this place, this particular place, out of all the places that exist. She thought about what it cost to lose that. Not just the land. The land was acreage. It was measurable. But the specific sound of a specific creek. The way a family's whole history of belonging to a place got compressed into a sensory detail that children and grandchildren carried in their bodies without understanding why. She thought about Thomas, about Nebraska, about the farm that was gone. She had not let herself think about it much since coming here. There had been too much else to manage, and grief, like everything else, required scheduling. But standing here at this creek on a Tuesday morning in June, she let herself think about it plainly. She had loved that farm. She had loved the particular flatness of the sky over those plains, the smell of the soil after rain, the way the light went horizontal in the evenings and turned everything amber. She had lost it, and losing it had been a real loss, and she was not going to pretend otherwise just because she had built something new. You could hold two true things at once, the loss and the new thing, the grief and the going forward. She'd learned that in the year after Thomas died, when she'd had to keep making breakfast for 9 children while something in her was completely unable to understand that he was gone, and she'd done both, made the breakfast, been unable to understand, and the world had not required her to resolve that contradiction before continuing. She heard footsteps in the grass behind her and didn't turn around. Cole came and stood beside her. He'd come from somewhere on the ranch, still had his work gloves on, the particular smell of a man who'd been with horses all morning. They looked at the creek together for a while. "Wei-Chen is coming next month," Cole said, "to see the land." "I know. I wrote to him about the boundary markers." "I thought you might have." He was quiet for a moment. "He's bringing his daughter." She looked at him. He was looking at the creek. "She's 8, he said. He wrote that she'd never been to Montana. He paused. "I thought, maybe we could show them around. The drainage, the old foundation. Let her see where the cabin was." Evelyn thought about an 8-year-old girl standing where she was standing now, hearing this sound for the first time, and not knowing yet that she'd been carrying it in her blood her whole life. "Yes," she said. "We'll do that." Cole nodded. He put his hands in his coat pockets, a gesture she'd come to know as what he did when he was thinking about something he wasn't sure how to say. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what this place is now, what it should be, going forward." He looked across the creek drainage at the land that ran east toward the tree line. "My father built it on something rotten, and I inherited that. I can't make it not have happened, but I can. The land that stays mine, the parts that were legitimately acquired, that we're keeping, I want it to be something different. Not just a cattle operation, something that—" He stopped. "I don't have the right words for it." "Something that remembers," Evelyn said. He looked at her. "That's what Margaret's list was," she said. "It wasn't just an accounting. It was a record. She wanted someone to remember what was taken and who it belonged to." She looked back at the creek. "That's what you're building. A place that holds the record of itself. The full record, not just the parts that reflect well." He was quiet for a long moment. The creek ran over its stones, and the wind came down from the mountains, and the June sky over them was that particular high-altitude blue that still surprised her sometimes with how much sky there was in it. "I couldn't have done this without you," he said, not as flattery, as a fact, delivered with the directness of someone who meant it precisely. "I know," she said, "and you couldn't have done it without Margaret, who started it, or Tom, who wrote A Mountain in the Dark, or Ethan." She paused. "Or Clara Beaumont's grandfather, who kept his homestead filing and gave it to his daughter, who gave it to her daughter, who kept it in a box for 40 years. That's a lot of people to credit. That's how things actually get done," she said. "Not one person, a chain of people, each one carrying it as far as they can and then handing it to the next." She finally turned and looked at him. "We were the ones who happened to be holding it at the right moment, that's all. It doesn't make us heroes. It makes us fortunate that there were enough people in the chain who didn't drop it." He looked at her with that expression she still hadn't fully named. The full-weight one, the unguarded one. "You have a way," he said, "of making things smaller than they are." "I have a way of making things the size they actually are," she said. "Other people make them too large. That's not modesty. It's accuracy." He almost said something, then didn't, and instead he reached over and took her hand. Not dramatically, not with any particular announcement, just his hand around hers in the casual way of people who have decided they're allowed to do that and have stopped making it a moment every time. They stood at the creek together for a while longer. Behind them, distantly, the ranch went on, the sound of the twins conducting whatever operation they were currently convinced was a good idea, Tom's voice somewhere in the corrals, Clara calling one of the younger children for something. The ordinary noise of a full house and a working ranch that didn't stop for reflection and didn't need to, because the people in it had learned to carry the reflection with them while they worked. Evelyn had spent a year, after Thomas died, waiting to feel like herself again, waiting for the grief to finish and the real life to resume, as though the grief were a tunnel with an exit and the real life were waiting for her on the other side of it. She'd learned, slowly and without anyone telling her in words, that it didn't work that way. The grief didn't end. The real life didn't wait. Both of them went on simultaneously, tangled together, and the self that came out the other side of that tangle was not the self that went in. It was something different, built from what had broken, and what had held, and what had been found in unexpected places, including a newspaper advertisement in a Helena Gazette, and a locked room full of ledgers and a creek in a Montana valley that sounded, she now understood, exactly the way a home was supposed to sound. She was 35 years old. She had 9 children and a husband who was still learning how to be the man he intended to be, and a ranch that was trying to make good on a bad history, and a collection of improbable people who had found their way here for various reasons and stayed. She was not finished grieving Thomas. She was not finished being afraid of what could still go wrong. She was not, in any clean or satisfying way, healed. She was instead alive. Fully and specifically alive in the way that required accepting everything that came with it, the loss and the love, the exhaustion and the purpose, the broken parts and the parts that held. That was not nothing. It was, in fact, everything. The creek ran on over its stones. The mountains held their positions against the sky. Somewhere behind her, a child, she thought it was Lily by the pitch of it, laughed at something with the full-body unself-consciousness of a 6-year-old who had not yet learned to hold herself back from things that were funny, and the sound of it carried out over the grass and the water and up into the clear June air. And Evelyn Harper Mercer stood at the edge of the land and felt it land in her chest like something she hadn't known she was waiting for. She held on to Cole's hand and listened to her daughter laugh, and the creek kept moving, and the day kept going, and the frontier, indifferent and enormous and not given to easy resolutions, went on around them all, as it always had and would continue to, long after their particular story had been absorbed into the long record of people who had come to difficult places and decided, against the evidence, to stay.